Welcome everyone to this info session on escaping this nightmare of a country. Yes, give it up for other places. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, along with my partner, Donnie Jokum. The Bureau is an independent, all-volunteer queer bookstore that Donnie and I founded in 2012, and we've been here at the LGBT Community Center since 2014. We are all volunteer, as I said, so we rely on donations and sales to keep this machine going. Today, there's no book related to the event, but we do encourage you to look around and buy something if you can or want to. But if you know you won't be buying anything, we would love it if you can make a donation. There's some change in the bag if you need that. There's also a QR code for Venmo if you're able to do a donation that way. So I'll pass that around. And anyone watching online, if you'd like to make a donation to the Bureau, you can do that on Venmo at BGSQD. So our regular bookstore hours are Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. We often stay open later when we have events in the evenings. And if you're not already on our email list, you can sign up for that at the back by the register or on our website, bgsqd.com. And you'll get an email every other Monday about our many upcoming events. We do have a very busy calendar, so please do check that out. And we hope you'll join us again for future events. Before I introduce Jeremy, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. The Bureau also recognizes Palestinian liberation as a fundamental part of our collective queer liberation. And we encourage you to read the statement we have at the back in the corner there about why we feel it's important for queer people in particular to speak out at this moment in solidarity with Palestinians. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Jeremy Bierbach, who came to us through the lovely Kate Huh, someone a queer artist, wonderful human being we've known since before we had a space, I think. So when Kate said, I have a friend coming from Holland who would be happy to talk about the possibility of immigrating for queer and trans folks, I said, yes, this is definitely something we want to do. So Jeremy Bierbach is originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In 2001, Jeremy emigrated to the Netherlands, where he studied law at the University of Amsterdam and became an attorney specialized in EU civil rights law and Dutch immigration and citizenship law. He lives with his husband in Zaandam, just outside of Amsterdam. Please give him a very warm welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Greg. I feel so honored that you were able to make the time for me. This literally was conceived about 8 or 9 days ago because I was coming to the States anyways because at the end of next week I'm going to a conference in Philadelphia for my academic area of interest, European Union Studies Association conference. I'm presenting about something about EU citizenship there. And, but you know, it felt, I mean, I've started to get used to saying we live in wartime now. It really is. I mean, this is. I don't know if it's going to be World War III, but we live in wartime. We live in a time of persecution of our sort, persecution of migrants. We live in a time of fascism and conservative backlashes to the progress that's been achieved in society. And so it wouldn't have been right for me to just make the rest of this trip be a vacation. I felt, I owed something to my community to, to give back, to make this, to do some work while I'm here. And I'm really, really, really happy to see full house. Like, I was actually slightly nervous, like, how many people won't show up, something like that. It's really, you give me energy. I'm really glad to see it. I brought something. I didn't know how much seating was. I brought something. I brought a lot of something. If anyone wants stroke apple, to pass these around. These are not vegan, unfortunately. They are dairy. So just go ahead and sit back and enjoy. They're made with butter. So yeah, speaking of the history of colonialism and genocide, well, guess what? I'm here in New Amsterdam. Interesting then that I'm here telling people how to go back, so to speak, which seems appropriate somehow. Amsterdam and New York really are, of course, parent and daughter cities in a certain way. I really love living in Amsterdam. It's been, I moved there because I was just obsessed with it. I became obsessed with Amsterdam when I was like 19 in 1994, the first time I went there. And it has not disappointed. It has really been, it is one of the world's truly great cities. It's a small city too. It's only about 850,000 people. It's like a city about the size of, say, like San Francisco in that sense. It's not a population-wise big city, but it's a city that has outsized importance. And it's really one of the most, is one of the most international cities in the world. I mean, it's said as a truism. I regularly go to citizenship ceremonies in Amsterdam where people are being sworn in as Dutch citizens. It's always very sort of touching, and then there's always the assistant mayor giving a speech saying Amsterdam is the most international city in the world. We count 181 nationalities. I regularly just sit in the park, enjoying it, just listening to the languages that people speak as they're bicycling or walking past. And I've counted, I studied linguistics. I like to think I'm good at recognizing languages. I regularly hear languages I don't even recognize there. And it's not just tourists, it's actually, people living there. Amsterdam is very, so I shouldn't talk too much about Amsterdam because it's about the Netherlands in general, but there is something actually special about Amsterdam compared to the Netherlands. They're a special type. Even my husband is born and raised in Amsterdam. And I said to him, well, the fact that you're, born and raised 6th generation Amsterdammers does make you different than other Dutch people. It makes it that, it's been a city that's always been very open to the world. And so, yeah, it's enabled me to really develop myself. I moved there and for work originally, but then I became disillusioned with my work. And due to a number of twists and turns, I said, hey, why don't I go back to school? And I studied law. There I studied Dutch law, which is, law there is actually an undergraduate study. So it sort of felt like going back. I was 25 years old and, sort of like, oh God, I'm going back to school with all these like 19-year-olds. And, but I pushed through it. I hated it, at first, but, I pushed through it. I didn't know that I was going to end up practicing immigration law, but then I started working in an immigration law clinic when I was a second-year student, and I thought, wow, this is it for me. I love it. I love I get the logic of it. I get the way that it works, and I feel like then I get really enthusiastic about telling people, how they can make it happen. Me and some other co-conspirators in Amsterdam, this builds, by the way, this is not purely my own idea, but this also builds on a webinar that me and a group of other queer co-conspirators, queer, also all-American immigrant co-conspirators organized 3 weeks ago, the Friday before Easter, a webinar for queer and trans Americans thinking about immigrating to the Netherlands, and we were a 6-person panel, including a medical doctor, including some people who talked about their own immigration experiences, some racialized people who talked about their experience living in the Netherlands. Very sad that none of them could be here today. It's 9 p.m. there, so on a Saturday night, so it's a little less convenient. I did ask if anyone wanted to appear as a talking head on a monitor, but I'll try to bring with me the messages that I remember hearing from them, especially about the medical stuff. So you can't. I have some basic knowledge about that as it relates to HRT and other needs of trans people, of course. But I'll concentrate on the legal side. I'm a lawyer, and so normally as a lawyer, I'm an immigration lawyer. I practice what we call in academia non-forced migration, meaning I practice all areas of immigration in the Netherlands that are not asylum, that are not actually technically related to somebody fleeing from their home country, saying, I'm in a dangerous situation in my home country, and therefore the Netherlands has to give me refuge. I practice what's called regular immigration law, non-forced migrants, people who already have an in Dutch immigration law, where Dutch immigration law provides for a slot for certain people to say, if you satisfy these conditions, you can get a right to stay here. As US citizens, you are all extraordinarily privileged. You know, you are the global minority. You know, there's now a terminology talking about, you know, the people in the world who have, you know, were being thought of as weaker passports are really the global majority. And, you know, the history of why movements are regulated of people from the global majority has a lot to do with the history of colonialism and ideas, you know, deeply baked in ideas that white people, you know, especially Europeans, should have the right to go wherever they want in the world, and black and brown people should have their movements restricted. And that was the case when European countries were colonizing the rest of the world. They also restricted movements of their colonial subjects to the home countries. And it is true to this day. If you can look up online, you can look up the passport index or the quality of nationality index, where different citizenships are ranked in terms of, with your passport, how many countries do you have visa-free access to as a visitor, and how many countries do you have rights of actual settlement in. Now, of course, the top 30, or the top 20, the top 30 on that list are all EU and EEA countries, European Economic Area countries. European Economic Area includes countries that are not part of the EU but act like they are, which is Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. And then Switzerland does its own thing, it also acts like it's in the EU. So if you have a passport from any of those countries, those are the most powerful passports in the world, of course, because they allow you to actually live and work in any of those other 31 countries in that block. But, you know, of course, right underneath that, at number 32 is the United States of America, because the United States of America ranks also up there in terms of countries that grant you visa-free access as visitors. You know, as US citizens, as US passport holders, you're entitled to go to Europe, or you're entitled to go to the area that's called the Schengen area. It's very confusing because it's most of the EU, but not all the EU, and then some non-EU countries. This is the area of free. This is the area within the European continent where there's no border controls internally. So there's there's a big fence on the outside where you do get checked going in and out, but then internally there's no fences, so to speak. You can go from the Netherlands to Germany, to Italy, to Poland, to Estonia, you know, all over land, and in theory don't get stopped, you know, or checked what you're doing. But when you're coming in, you get checked, of course. And if you're a US citizen, your right to be there in the Schengen area without a visa. People mistakenly call it a tourist visa, but you're exempt from the requirement of going to an embassy of a European country or a consulate here to get your visa beforehand. You arrive, they say, yeah, you know, looks like you could probably take care of yourself as a tourist. Looks like you probably have a plan for going back. You know, we trust you, you're Western. And they put a stamp in your passport just to mark when you entered. And the idea is you can stay for up to 90 days in any given 180-day period. So you can go 30 in, 30 out, 30 in, 30 out, 30 in, 30 out indefinitely, or you can stay for 90 and then go out again for 90 days. The old backpackers lore is not true, that if you've stayed 90 days, you just have to go out and come in and get a stamp again. That's based on the misconception that the stamp itself is a visa, that it's permission. But what would happen if you were coming as a tourist and you did overstay, or if you if you left on day 90 and then tried to come back and they wouldn't let you in, first of all, or if you overstayed the 90 days and you tried to leave, they would give you an entry ban. They would put a big X in your passport and say, you abused that privilege, you're not allowed to come in anymore without a visa. So that's, to start with, many of you may have already visited Europe, you've already experienced that, but then what happens when you want to stay for longer? So in that regard, US citizens are also extremely privileged as well. To start with, US citizens are part of what I call the G7 countries, which is the seven countries outside the EU and EEA, that at least in the Netherlands, gives the special permission of also being allowed to apply for long-term stay without already having a visa in the first place. So there's no requirement for US citizens to go to, there's a Dutch consulate in New York, in fact, there's no requirement for US citizens to go to the Dutch consulate in New York to already get pre-approved, to be issued a visa to take a one-way flight to the Netherlands. You're exempted from the requirement to already have a visa. So The other 7 countries are Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, and the United Kingdom, which is now not in the EU. And then the third level of privilege that US citizens have is you have an opportunity to stay. You know, I always like to start explaining this by talking about how, you know, the Netherlands is not a welcoming country in general to non-EU citizens. It has extremely strict immigration law. And the entire time I've lived in the Netherlands has been just tediously dominated in the political discourse about a super anti-immigrant discourse. Of course, immigrants are always racialized in that sense. You know, there's always there's people who like jump through hoops to say like, oh, but you know, you're not really an immigrant. That's where the E word comes in. You're an expat. And I really disapprove of this term. And so if you're going to be a client of mine, you're not going to be an expat. Expat is a term of privilege. Expat is a term of sort of saying that white Westerners, they're probably not going to stay forever anyways. They're expatriating themselves from their home country, but they're waiting to go back to their patria, you know, but they're not really going to stay. So getting that out of the way, terminology. But so despite all this anti-immigrant discourse, you know, so the anti-immigrant discourse is sort of, you know, the typical claiming that they're coming to take our jobs or whatever. The paranoia extends mainly to 2 categories of migrants, one being asylum seekers. That's been a ridiculous hysteria in Dutch political discourse especially for the last 5 years out of nothing, where asylum makes up like less than 10% of the annual migration to the Netherlands. And also racialization of minorities within the Dutch population. The racialized minorities in the Dutch population are people who come from the Dutch colonial history, most prominently Indonesia, which used to be a Dutch colony, although the Indonesians who moved to the Netherlands, they usually considered themselves Dutch. They fled the independence of Indonesia and came to the Netherlands. And then people from the post-colonial history, Suriname is another one. It was a former Dutch colony in South America, where the population is largely of African and South Asian origin. And Suriname became independent in 1975, which led to many Surinamese people deciding to choose a future of remaining Dutch and moving to the Netherlands. And so the other aspect of migration that gets stigmatized in Dutch political discourse is family reunification, the right to have the partner of your choice. That has been treated restrictively because there's this idea that if you're Dutch and you have a foreign partner, what's wrong with you? That must mean you're not integrated in society. You're importing somebody from your home country. Or maybe you're some kind of loser and you're like importing a mail order bride, and there's all these very, you know, these assumptions of, you know, of certain types. You're importing a mail order bride because it's all assumed as a she'll be subservient to you, and so forth. That's always been very restrictive. Whereas the Netherlands is relatively open when it comes to work-related migration. You know, the Netherlands does recognize that immigrants do have, with high skills, between quotes, do maybe have something more to add to the economy. So I'll just start off with like the standard, you know, categories that Dutch immigration law works with, just to then get to the dessert, you know, sort of build it up like dramatic tension to talk about how unwelcoming the Netherlands is, to then talk about how welcoming it can be to you, because you can fit into a slot of the system. So the normal slots, if you want to move there, are, well, you either have a partner who's Dutch or an EU citizen. Oddly enough, it's actually easier if you have a partner who's an EU citizen from, say, Germany, Latvia, Italy, Spain, than it is if you have a partner who's Dutch, because that goes back to the restrictive requirements of family reunification for Dutch citizens. They are, you know, generally racialized. But for work, typically, what you have to do to immigrate to the Netherlands, to work in a job in employment, usually the main route is what's called being a high-skilled migrant, which I always put that between quotes because it's not really about your skills, it's about how much you're getting paid. It's about how much an employer wants to pay you. So the idea is, if a Dutch employer wants to pay you about 70,000 a year, 60,000 a year, the idea is you must be valuable enough for the Dutch economy that the employer is then not required to look all over the EU for a qualified EU citizen. So, you know, if you get a job working for one of the corporations that has settled in the Netherlands, like Booking.com or Uber or something like that, and they'll pay you, they're going to pay you, a typical sort of tech salary. The idea is you'll be approved within 2 weeks and you get to come right away. Of course, you are still handcuffed to them. It's a golden handcuff. It means you can't leave that employer unless you find another employer who wants to pay you another high amount. So that's not, that's also not all it's cracked up to be. It's not, there's no way to immigrate and just get the right to work wherever you want. That is still always a right that is reserved to EU citizens. And normally, the other way to immigrate for work-related purposes is if you want to be an entrepreneur, if you want to have a business, if you want to be your own boss. And normally that's really hard, really hard. There's two ways to do that. One is you say, I have a business, and this is my business plan, and my business is going to be of economic importance to the Netherlands. So then the Dutch Immigration Authority takes your business plan and they send it to the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs for an evaluation based on this point system. The rejection rate is something like 98%. It's a point system based on what are your personal qualities, what are your personal experiences. Normally people can get enough points on that. How many years of entrepreneurial experience do you have? How many years of senior level experience do you have? But then the harder part is, have you done market research as to who your competitors are on the market in the Netherlands? What is so great about your product or service that's not already on offer? Have you been financed by a Dutch bank for over 100,000? That means the bank must have evaluated your business plan and thought you were a good catch. And are you going to create jobs other than your own? Those are the normal considerations for whether you're going to be allowed to stay as an entrepreneur. And by the way, in Dutch immigration law, there's no distinction between being an entrepreneur, owning a business, and being a freelancer. Really important to understand. So that means for most people who are freelancers, who have a business that's just based on their own intellectual capital, based on the contents of their own brain, who are just directly interfacing with their customers, it's pretty hard to get enough points on that point system. You have to show that you have like really exceptional something, some skills or some idea that people are beating down your door to get to. So that's normally how hard it is to immigrate as a non-EU citizen to the Netherlands. Okay, now we get to the fun part. So the Netherlands and the USA signed a treaty in 1956 called, it has an official name now, that everybody always forgets, which is the Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation between the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the United States of America. The Kingdom of the Netherlands and the United States of America, desirous of strengthening the bonds of peace and friendship traditionally existing between them, and of encouraging closer economic and cultural relations between their peoples, and being cognizant of the contributions which may be made toward these ends by arrangement promoting mutually advantaged commercial intercourse, encouraging mutually beneficial investments, and establishing mutual rights and privileges. See, this is what's fun about talking for a queer audience. Normally I'm very neutral, as an immigration lawyer, but now we can go a little more on the edge. So on and so on. But the background of this was of course the Cold War. This was a treaty that was pushed by the US, actually. This is part of a charm offensive that was going on at the time when the US was trying to outcompete the Soviet Union on the world stage for influence in the world. The US was trying to outcompete with soft power. And this is 1956. So the US signed a bunch of these friendship treaties. There's other Western European countries that the US signed these with, also Denmark, Belgium, I don't know who else. Iran, by the way, there's still friendship treaty between the United States and Iran, still in force. But it was all about the US trying to outcompete the Soviet Union. And so you look at most of this treaty, and most of it seems, what we'd say, anodyne. It seems like, oh, do you need a treaty to guarantee that? It says, nationals of one party, when they go to the territory of the other party, shall have freedom of speech, shall have freedom of religion, etc. You think to yourself, well, why wouldn't anybody have freedom of speech or freedom of religion? Is there a distinction made between foreigners? Well, guess what, in the US that distinction is now being made. Exactly, people who have green cards are now just being deported just for having the wrong opinions or publishing op-eds in their university newspapers. But, so I used to say, I actually had to think twice, well, maybe it's not so anodyne after all that this guarantee is made for, foreigners on the territory of the other. But, most of it is like sort of about free trade. We won't interfere with the operations of each other's businesses when they're on each other's territories. Mostly a sort of forgettable, treaty. I mean, the US and the Netherlands, they were already bound up in so many other webs of international arrangements like NATO, and long historical, friendship that, this treaty seems like a little bit like, okay, whatever. The most controversial part for the Dutch legislature when they were debating whether to ratify the treaty in 1956. The history of the Netherlands, if you know anything about it, is one of absolute hate between different religions, basically. The history of the Netherlands is 300 years of Protestants and Catholics hating each other. The historical dividing line in Europe between which part of Europe became Protestant, which part became Catholic, went straight through the Netherlands, ending I think it was the 30 Years' War in the 17th century or something like that. And it had its echo in that, for like 300 years to come. Dutch society was characterized by the concept of tolerance, which sounds like a wonderful thing, but tolerance was just like, okay, I'm not gonna bash your skull in. If you do your thing over there and I do my thing over there, originally related to religious practice. If you wanna be Catholic, then you just go off in your, behind the closed doors of your Catholic church and do your Catholic thing. We'll be Protestant over here. And Dutch politics was characterized until well into the 70s by this division between Protestants and Catholics. And so the most controversial part about the Dutch-American Friendship Treaty when it was being debated by Parliament, I've looked up the parliamentary record, was the extreme Protestant parties in the Netherlands said, freedom of religion? This means that all these Roman Catholic Americans are gonna move over here, move into our Protestant villages and start having processions with saints on a Sunday or a day of rest. Offending us with their popery. That was the most controversial part of it at that time. So the treaty was just mostly forgotten about for years. Most prominently in the early 80s, or late 70s, one American did try to claim asylum based on the treaty. His name was Edward Ayers, and he was somebody who fled. He was a former CIA operative who knew too much. And he decided to blow the whistle on what the US was doing in Vietnam about various issues. So he had to flee the US and he tried to claim asylum in various places. And his claim to being able to get asylum based on the Dutch-American Friendship Treaty didn't succeed. But in the late 90s, that's when some immigration lawyers in particular found this old treaty and blew the dust off of it and saw, wait, there's actually a provision in this treaty that gets people something. It's not just about the relationship between two countries. This has an individually invocable right in it that individuals can actually invoke. And that is in Article 2 of the treaty, where it says, nationals of either party shall be permitted to enter the territories of the other party and to remain therein, A, for the purpose of carrying on trade between the territories of the two parties, and engaging in related commercial activities. B, for the purpose of developing and directing the operations of an enterprise in which they have invested or in which they are actively in the process of investing a substantial amount of capital. And what was really neat about that B especially is substantial amount of capital was still defined in 1956 terms. So 10,000 Dutch guilders in the money that was in force in 1956 is now 4,500 euros in today's money. Used to be, you could say a euro was approximately $1. That's changing by the day. I watch the exchange rates every day. I think now a euro is about $1.20, but still 4,500 euros isn't that much money. It was a substantial amount of capital in 1956 and it isn't anymore today, which makes it very attractive to make use of the B option. Nobody makes use of the A option, by the way, because if you were to make use of the A option and say my business is directed toward trade, they'd be like, okay, show us the import-export permits that you applied for, show us that you rented warehouses, show us, what you're actually going to be shipping back and forth. Nobody would ever do that, even if you did have a business oriented towards shipping things, importing and exporting things between the United States and the Netherlands. You'd just use option B anyways. Why wouldn't you? You'd just make a business and you'd invest 4,500 euros in it. So this means, since immigration lawyers were consistently able to invoke this before the courts, the Dutch Immigration Authority was forced to accept this. The first thing that it means is when you want to stay as an entrepreneur or as a freelancer, you are exempt from the test of whether your business satisfies a vital Dutch interest, as long as you make that investment in your business. So that's the first meaning of it. The Immigration Authority, until about 20 years ago, they tried to say, okay, but the rest of Dutch immigration law still applies. I mean, that is in general a truism. You do have to think, people talk about, what does the DAFT say, or what rights do I have based on the DAFT? Well, it's Dutch immigration law as a whole that determines the conditions for your stay, and you're simply just exempt from a few aspects of that due to this treaty line. So until about 20 years ago, the Dutch Immigration Authority did try to say to American entrepreneurs when they were renewing their residence permits, well, okay, we let you in without testing your business. You have a completely useless business, you have like a dog walking business or something. This is literally the kind of business you can do. You can do like really anything, like dog walking, teaching English, any kind of, sort of like tea to China businesses. You could try to, say you're gonna make an American stroopwafel, a bakery, whatever you want. We exempted you from that, but fair enough, the rest of Dutch immigration law is concerned with, are you making enough to support yourself? So they tried to subject renewal to the condition of proving that you were making enough money to support yourself. In today's money, that amount of money is defined as about 1,700 euros a month for a single person, which is obviously not actually enough to get by. Everybody knows how expensive it is, but it is this, this definition of that. So, you want to see that you're making that much for your business. Nope, the courts said they struck that down too. The person who was denied renewal for not earning enough money from his business appealed that to the courts, and the court said the treaty does not say anything about a business with which you are supporting yourself. The treaty only says in which you have invested a substantial amount of capital and which you are actively running and developing. And that's the key, that's another key aspect. So you have two jobs to get the benefit of the Dutch-American Friendship Treaty, to get the exemption from everything else. One, have your investment of 4,500 euros, maintain it. You maintained it in your business in the form of equity, which is an accounting term. It means, people on internet forums often a little too facilely describe this as putting 4,500 euros in a Dutch bank account and leaving it there. Not exactly. It's, yes, that starts the process, that gets you there, that means that's your initial investment, but it's always about having a Dutch accountant doing your books, auditing your business, making sure, does your business have enough assets that if you subtract all the outstanding debts, you're left with 4,500 euros. That's the definition of equity. Equity is defined as the value, the assets in a business that can be attributed to you, as the owner and don't belong to anyone else. So, it means having a business means even just being a freelancer, it means paying a professional to take care of your books. It doesn't have to be expensive, but it does mean administrative work. That's sort of the implicit job number 3. You have to not cheap out too much and think you can just do your own bookkeeping in an Excel spreadsheet. You have to have a professional keeping an eye on you, because that is what helps you keep an eye on whether you are satisfying the conditions of the treaty. And the other requirement, the other job, is you have to have an actually active business. A lot of people think that it's just about keeping 4,500 euros in a bank account and then you're just allowed to hang out and do what you want. But what would happen when it comes time to renew 2 years later is you submit an annual report, you audited yourself, you showed this is the investment, this was the profit and loss report, and they would say the profit and loss report shows like 0 revenue, 0 expenses. What were you actually doing? Oh, I thought I just had to maintain my investment. Nope, your residence permit will be revoked for that. But if you can satisfy those conditions, and then if you can satisfy another condition, and this is the really important one to explain, and it also really helps that, of course, I'm American and I understand how things work here, so I often explain it by contrast to how things work in the United States, is you are then restricted to only working in self-employment. This means you cannot apply for jobs. If you're walking down the street, if it's not going so well with your business and you're not managing to support yourself, if you're walking down the street and you see a help wanted sign on the bookstore or the bar or the cafe, if you were to go in and apply for that job, the owner would say, okay, show me your residence permit, show me your long-term visa ID. On the back of it, it has an endorsement saying in Dutch, work in self-employment. Other work only permitted if employer has a work permit. And every employer knows that a work permit is really hard to get. A work permit is the process of looking all over the EU and proving that you took all the applications of qualified EU citizens and you couldn't find one, which means then you get a permit to employ this non-EU citizen for what is probably a low or medium paying job. If it were a high paying job, you wouldn't have this problem in the first place. So, you have to get used to the idea of being your own boss, of being reliant on yourself, of being able to either support yourself from your income from self-employment, or to have enough resources to support yourself otherwise. You can, live off of savings, live off of a pension, something like that. If you have other resources to live off of, you can. But keep in mind that against the background of Dutch immigration law does not normally allow for digital nomads or a retirement visas or anything like that. That doesn't exist in the Netherlands. I get people calling me all the time saying, I'm a multi-cajillionaire, and I'm going to buy 5 canal mansions in the center of Amsterdam and I want to hang out there. I'm like, nope, that doesn't exist in Dutch immigration law. No matter how wealthy you are, you cannot just buy a right to stay there. The Netherlands does not sell visas, does not sell real estate for visas. The UK did that. That's why all of central London is filled with empty houses. All the fancy neighborhoods like Chelsea and Kensington are filled with basically empty houses that were built by oligarchs and billionaires from other countries who wanted to buy themselves a visa in the UK, but buy them real estate, and they don't actually live there. They use it as a pied a terre, which is a waste. The Netherlands, as you know, has people say housing crisis. It's always had a housing crisis, always had an extreme shortage of housing, very densely populated country, very crowded with a shortage of housing. So there's also an idea of you should never encourage people just to buy properties and leave them vacant. So that's also why it's also not a basis for selling visas or something like that. But you might be a multi-cajillionaire and you might want to buy 5 canal mansions. Great, but you got to have a little bit of hustle then. Then just do that dog walking business, maybe, or bake cookies, and sell them in front of your door, something, There's not much, that's required in terms of the, you just have to get a little bit of a wiggle on. If you can get renewed, you can get your residence permit renewed as long as the bottom line of your business or the profit and loss report of your business shows that you're at least trying. You can even be running a loss. You can even be having less revenue than the expenses that you're spending on developing your business. But if you're developing your business, if you're paying somebody to design a website for you, if you're printing flyers, if you're renting office space, that shows you're at least trying. That's all that's required. So you gotta have a little bit of hustle. That said, there is a little bit of room available for people who don't have the hustle or who would rather work at the bar or the bookshop. And those are people who are coming to the Netherlands with their partners. Because there's a really neat rule of Dutch immigration law. This is not just restricted to Americans based on the Dutch-American Friendship Treaty, but there's a really neat rule where they want to make the Netherlands more attractive to the people who might come as entrepreneurs. They recognize that maybe they have a spouse or partner who doesn't want to be an entrepreneur, doesn't want to be restricted in their work. So there's a special privilege that when you have a dependent status, being dependent on somebody who has a residence permit as an entrepreneur, you are allowed to work wherever you want. You are allowed to go to the restaurant, you are allowed to go to the bar, you are allowed to even, apply for, higher paying jobs, and you can tell the employer, look, you don't have to go through sponsorship formalities for me. I'm here with my partner, and that means I'm allowed to work wherever I want. So a lot of couples do make the decision of who's happier being a freelancer, who's happier being, being an entrepreneur, and who would rather apply for jobs. They make that decision on their own. So that's possible. Dutch immigration law is really, now this general background of Dutch immigration law, one of the really neat things about Dutch immigration law, and I indicated that in the introductory text, if you have a partner, you don't have to be married. Dutch immigration law is actually very progressive about that. But there's a whole interesting history about it. Since 1975, the Netherlands has allowed for immigration of unmarried partners, including same-sex partners. So it's the first country in the world that had same-sex migration benefits. It was always worded in the laws, if you have a relationship, if you have a durable and exclusive relationship, which can be equated to a marriage, your right to be here. And if you're not already married to somebody else, that's the other requirement. You can't be polygamous. You can't be married to somebody else. You have to be able to show that you're marriageable to each other. Then you can also immigrate. That's really cool. I mean, even before the Netherlands introduced same-sex marriage in 2001, it was still already possible to immigrate as the unmarried, unregistered, unformalized partner of someone. It just has a slightly higher burden of proof. You just have to answer a questionnaire about where did you meet, how did you meet, how did you fall in love, what's the story of what's your love story, show us some pictures, show us some plane tickets, but it's not that bad. It doesn't usually typically involve an interview or anything like that. So the world is your oyster, if you want to move to the Netherlands. It is also really important to me to impress upon Americans. Americans often think of the EU as this country, And it's not, of course, it is, the EU has arguably aspirations to be something like the United States, to be something like a federal state, but it's not right now, and especially in the area of immigration. The area of immigration law for non-EU citizens is still on a completely country-by-country basis in the EU, at least at the outset, at least for coming in. It means if you want to stay in the Netherlands, then you apply for stay in the Netherlands on the basis of Dutch immigration law. You get a residence permit. This is the term we use for a long-term visa, by the way. It looks like, just like an ID card, so a biometric ID card. That is actually an EU standardized format. It's standardized so that other countries in the EU, other countries in the Schengen area will recognize that you have a valid right of residence in one of the countries in the Schengen area. So this does mean you have an unlimited right of circulation, as it's called, in the entire Schengen area. You can, if you want to go, rent a vacation apartment in Barcelona for a month, knock yourself out. You can do that. I mean, you can't live there, you can't move there, but you can be a tourist there as much as you want. So also, that's one thing I have to clarify to people. They say, well, actually, me and my partner really want to move to Barcelona. We can't figure out how to do that via Spanish immigration law, so we're thinking we would do it this way, do the draft. I'm like, nah, make it, the Netherlands wants to feel a little bit special, Another common question is there a physical presence requirement as far as that goes? I do always discourage anybody who, that's why one reason we don't use the term visa for what you get. I always discourage people from thinking of it as just a visa that you can get and put in your back pocket and then, go off, gallivanting around the world or going back to the United States and knowing that you have this sort of, escape parachute if you want one. It's not the idea. That's not what it's meant to be. Having a residence permit means you are supposed to actually reside in the Netherlands, and I'll get into everything that entails, since that's in a certain way a lot more complex than immigration law. Actually, I'll have to explain some details about how the Netherlands works. I'll try to limit it to like 15 more minutes for my general story, and then we have lots of time for Q&A. So the idea is, so then people ask, well, what is the physical presence requirement? What is the minimum amount of time that I have to be in the Netherlands? Well, don't think about it that way. If you're already thinking in terms of what's the minimum amount of time you can spend in the Netherlands, it's probably not the right place for you. You should be happy to be living there. But what the requirement of Dutch immigration law primarily is that you remain domiciled in the Netherlands. This idea of hoofdverblijf in Dutch. What is your main place of residence? Where is the center of your life? Where is the center of your interests? And where do you call home? And that's the idea, is you have to consider the Netherlands to be your home in all of your actions and thoughts, so to speak, to keep your residence permit, otherwise you can forfeit it. Dutch immigration policy does go on to say there are certain circumstances where you can be physically absent so much from the Netherlands that it does start to look like you moved your domicile away. So that's a secondary rule. They say if you spend more than 4 months a year, 3 years in a row outside the Netherlands, that can be an indication that you moved your domicile away. Of course, that's an indication that can be dispelled by any number of other reasons. Like, hey, I'm a freelance set designer and I got hired by a film company in Berlin to go and build a film set for them, and it was a 5-month job. It was because I was running my business. Of course, that's a legitimate reason. So it's mainly about you go away for 9 months. You and your partner go backpacking from the mouth of the Amazon up into the headwaters in Ecuador or something like that. It doesn't mean you move to South America. You can be on vacation as much as you want. So that's the only requirement. You have to want to live in the Netherlands. You have to stay domiciled there. And what do you get long term if you manage to stick it out? After 5 years, your first residence permit will be valid for 2 years. It's sort of like your probationary period. It's sort of like your chance to get your business running so that you can show something for it after 2 years, that you maintain your investment, that you're actually developing and running it. Then you apply for renewal. The renewal gets approved for another 5 years. This is still not unconditional. I mean, it's still probationary stage where you still have to satisfy the conditions of the permit. But once you make it to year 5, once you've been in the Netherlands for 5 total years, and if you can pass an exam of Dutch language and culture, I put it between quotes because it's not really useful knowledge. It's sort of like, it's incredibly, I don't know, it's a sort of bizarre multiple choice exam called Knowledge of Dutch Society, which is mainly just asking about what is the appropriate way to behave in social circumstances. It's sort of like, is it appropriate to drop by a friend's house unannounced when you want to hang out? No. You make an appointment 3 weeks in advance. You write it in your little black book that we have a dinner date at 6:30, Tuesday night. 3 weeks ago, I'm not like this at all. My husband's not like this either. But there's this idea of like that the great unwashed, people coming from outside of the world, they have to be taught basic, social skills or social rules. But it's still, anyone can pass it. You just have to lobotomize yourself and you pass it on. But there is an important part to the exam, which is Dutch proficiency. Currently, in only A2 level of Dutch is required. It's not that much. So it's the 4 exams of reading, writing, speaking, and understanding. But if you're moving to the Netherlands, this is really important. Make an effort. Make an effort to learn Dutch. Again, do not be an expat. Do not be one of those obnoxious expats who's like, can you talk to me in English? People do get frustrated because Dutch, of course, is not a language that you can pick up by osmosis. The Netherlands has one of the highest percentages of English fluency, English second language fluency of any country in the world. In their educational system, they recognized a long time ago that nobody else in the world speaks Dutch, other than half of Belgium and a portion of South Africa that speaks the language that's derived from Dutch, and Suriname. Nobody else in the world speaks Dutch. So the educational system placed an emphasis on learning English from an early age, and most Dutch people of a younger age are fluent in English, and they're always excited to show it off. There's also TV and movies in English language are always subtitled, not dubbed there. It's also nice for you, but it also means that Dutch people get a lot of exposure to English. And so almost without realizing, when a native Dutch speaker hears you speaking Dutch or struggling with it in a way that they hear an accent with you that they think your native language is English, they will just switch to English right away. They hear an English accent in Dutch as if it were English. They literally don't hear that you were even trying to speak Dutch. They're just like, oh, this is a transaction. Dutch people are very business oriented. There's a transaction to be done here. Let's do it as efficiently as possible. I'm going to switch back to English. So you cannot expect to learn it by osmosis. You cannot expect to learn it with Duolingo. Duolingo is already known to be one of the worst language learning methods there is. Pay someone. Pay a school, pay a tutor. You need it. You need a professional language teacher. You need to have that sheltered environment in which somebody will give you the space to make mistakes and they will correct you and you don't have to feel bad about it, and they will, they'll give you that opportunity. But really, make an effort, and it'll be rewarding, and get to know your neighbors as well. There's something actually that's kind of refreshing. In the last couple of years, the immigrant discourse in the Netherlands, the anti-immigrant discourse in the Netherlands, has gained a new aspect to it, which is refreshingly not racist, actually, for once. It is just generally about any immigrants, including expats, not integrating in society. It's also sort of an evil word, but there's been an interesting new term of insult created for people who come to work for multinational corporations and then move into previously working class neighborhoods, because they can pay more for real estate and pricing people out of the market. They're being increasingly called Pokemon zombies. People who see their new neighbor move in and their new neighbor is only all the time, walking down the street, walking up the stairs, staring at the screen, not saying hi, not saying hello, not introducing themselves, not saying, do you want to come over and have coffee with me when they move in? It's been I'm like, okay, well that's fair enough. That's a fair enough reason to be anti-migration. There's also a lot of political reasons. It's sort of like it's also multinational as well. Why? The part of that discourse is why did we decide that it was good for the Dutch economy to allow companies like Booking.com and Uber, which are basically just part of this new predatory model of capitalism, just to move to the Netherlands because the Netherlands has a good tax regime for international corporations. Is this really adding something to our society? That's another discourse. But so I would say, I'm there for you. Me and my co-conspirators are there for you. We want you to move. We want you to help clear things up for us. We think that you'll be an asset to Dutch society. And you know, Dutch society in return, and this is another part of the story that I gave during the webinar, has something for you. And you can see it as a form of self-care. Because the Netherlands is, say what you will, I mean, all the people, all my co-conspirators, we all come from the left, we're all very critical. There are a lot of fucked up things in Dutch society, a lot of latent racism, a lot of legacies of colonialism. But we all admitted to each other, this is all, you know, all my sort of, all these other, you know, queer American immigrants, we all recognize ourselves as still nowhere else we'd rather live. There are certain advantages. The Netherlands is always ranked high up on the list of rule of law. Rule of law is a term that you've been hearing a lot about in the news lately. The rule of law is everything that the Trump administration is not. It's everything that an autocracy is not. Everything that a dictatorship is not. Rule of law, so you know, the highest rankings on the rule of law index are always like the Netherlands, like Norway, you know, and Sweden. These are countries where rule of law is characterized by the government, agents of the government act on the basis of laws, on the basis of rules that are published, that are knowable, and the government, agents of the government act in a consistent way, a consistent and predictable way. What I say I like about being a lawyer in the Netherlands is it means I can predict the future. It's magic, you know, magic power that I have. Of course, these rules are published and they're very complicated. Of course, you do have to be a lawyer to understand it, but based on my complicated understanding of the law, I can say to you, if you come up with, you know, if you give the Dutch government A, you will get B in return. And that's actually a really nice thing. It's a really nice thing to have that sort of reliability, to know that you will not be treated arbitrarily, to know that you will not be treated differently based on your face, or, you know, whether somebody's in a bad mood that day and they want to exercise their, you know, their power over you. So, you know, that's also really nice. It's really, you can experience it as, you know, I recently helped, it was actually kind of heartwarming, but I had to really sort of yell at them. You know, I had some two recent clients who I helped, you know, they were some of my first clients who fled the Trump administration already starting in December. They started making their plans. I helped them out. They were a queer couple. One of them was trans, you know, and they, you know, after they got their approval decision, they'd flown over a couple of times to take care of things and find housing. You know, and after they got their approval decision, they had to fly back to the US to take care of some things. And they were like, you know, they didn't have their residence permit cards yet. You know, they had the approval decisions that I sent to them as PDFs, and they're like, well, what do we have to tell them when we're leaving? What do we have to tell them when we come back? When we come back, do we have to just say we're here as tourists? And I was like, what kind of country do you think this is? One that would expect you to lie? You got approved for a residence permit. Like, so what if you don't have your plastic card? You know, you rock up and you be like, fuck you, let me in. That's what's great about the Netherlands. That's like, that is the nice thing, you know, this is how, you know, this is almost how I go to court. You know, this is what, you know, well, it also helps that in court I have a special robe that I put on over this. But, you know, I don't take my piercings out or anything like that. There's a nice sort of unpretentiousness in the Netherlands where there's not much attitude about being different, as long as, you know, as long as everyone stays in their own space. You know, it's a culture, much like New York, it's a culture that's derived around dense population and people having to sort of just tolerate each other. You do your thing, I'll do mine. If you don't bother me, I won't bother you. There is a deep conservatism in the Netherlands. There is a deep underlying conservatism in the Netherlands. I liken the Netherlands in a certain way to Japan, in that both of them are countries that got rich off of trading with the world. Both of them are resource poor countries that learned early on that to survive, they had to be open economically, they had to trade, and who benefited a lot from incorporating various things that they picked up from other countries in the world. Yet both cultures have a very strong sense of insider and outsider that was sort of developed precisely in their interaction with the rest of the world. You know, if the world can come up to your doorstep, if the world, as in the center of Amsterdam with the canal belt, which essentially developed as a sort of inner harbor with which, you know, goods could be transported to, you know, warehouses from the ships that were docked in the harbor. there's always this notion of the world can come right up to your front door, but behind the front door is your own world. So there is a lot of Dutch society that is behind the door that is hard to get into. It's harder to make friends. People's social networks tend to be formed in elementary school. And doing business is hard. I also have to warn this, to my clients who are entrepreneurs, if they think they have a product or service that Dutch businesses are going to be jumping to get from them, like, well, good luck with that. People's business networks are pretty closed. They also they do business with they know. For the immigration purpose, by the way, there's no requirement that you have any Dutch customers for your business. So a lot of people, a lot of my most sort of successful clients at getting by have businesses that they can do anywhere in the world. They're like software developers or something like that. You can still have your customers elsewhere. And just the idea is you're channeling your revenue through your Dutch business. Other aspects. So then, okay, I'll get into the one last thing, which is the more complex, well, enough, I saved that for the last 5 minutes. The more complicated thing, so about explaining to get your right to be there, that's the easy part, because that's easy. It's about, everyone understands immigration law. Immigration law is based on, what's close to a worldwide standard, which is you have a right to be where you have citizenship and you don't automatically have the right to be where you don't have citizenship and you have to ask for permission to stay there. That's the premise of immigration law. So I've already been able to explain that if you're a US citizen, if you tick the boxes, check the boxes of the satisfying the conditions of this Dutch-American Friendship Treaty, you can get a right to stay there. But there's a lot of other aspects of the way the Dutch government deals with people that are very alien to Americans. If you've ever been an immigrant to the US, you may know that Dutch or U.S. immigration law is sort of, the U.S. sees itself as this sort of fortress, has this very high wall on the outside, and you get asked and interrogated, all this stuff, even if you're like marrying a U.S. citizen. But then the idea is once you're allowed in, then you're kind of just allowed to do whatever you want. The idea is if you've been married to a U.S. citizen, for instance, for 3 years, you get a green card, and then good luck with it. Nobody keeps an eye on you. You can be anywhere in between New York and Hawaii, doing whatever you want and nobody cares, because it's based on internally to the US, the government isn't really up in anybody's shit. The government doesn't really know what you're up to. So the US has this big fortress wall around the outside where they do, very intensely scrutinize people when they're coming in and out, but internally, there's not much, the government isn't in your business that much. Living in the Netherlands is a whole other ball of wax. The government is up in your business. All the time. If you are paranoid, if you don't like, if you're, sort of anti-statist, the Netherlands is not the place for you. There is an enormous amount of surveillance in a lot of ways. It's sort of benevolent surveillance with an enormous amount of surveillance. It's sort of like living in a big gated community. It's sort of like, the places in the US that are like gated communities where there's some sort of like covenant among the homeowners that they're not allowed to, put up Christmas lights, but they're only allowed to put up like sort of like tasteful, canvas, banners, at Christmas time, something like that. That why does the architecture in the Netherlands look so typical with such perfectly lined up, facades of the building there? Because it is zoned out the wazoo. If your house is out of line, it will be knocked down. It's a heavily, sort of zoned community. One of my first experiences when I moved there in 2001 was putting my trash out on the wrong night. And guess what? There's people whose job it is to then pick up that illegally put out trash, rip it open, go through it, look for envelopes in the trash, and figure out who you were so they can find you. This seems like a familiar story. The form of surveillance that is most unfamiliar to Americans, it's not like there's like cameras everywhere or anything like that, but the form of surveillance that's most unfamiliar to Americans is there's this idea called the population register. And this is common to most continental European countries. This is one of those divides in the world between everywhere that used to be a colony of England and everywhere that didn't. Most former British colonies don't have this concept. They have this concept of people just do kind of whatever they want internally and they bounce around. But everywhere in Europe that was ever colonized by either Napoleon, the Prussians, or the Habsburgers, so basically all of continental Europe, in their sort of legal administrative culture, they've set up an idea of a population register where everybody is in a central registry of where you live, who you are, who your parents are, who you're married to, who your children are, and that's all contained in a central registry. In the Netherlands, that registry was instituted during the time that the Netherlands was occupied by Napoleonic France. That was actually the first time when, so this is really interesting on the subject of identity. This is the first time that most Dutch people were obliged to take on surnames. Until like 1815, most Dutch people didn't have last names or didn't have family names in the sense that we have. They would say, they would have sort of patronymics, the way people in Iceland do or something like that. They would say like, oh, my name is Jeremy Carlson, or something like that. But it was the French who said, you've got to choose a last name. So that's why, most Dutch people said, well, I live next to a dike, so I'll be Van Dyke. Or, I come from Friesland, so I'll be De Vries. Those are the most common Dutch names. People were just like, whatever, okay, I have to pick something. All right, I'll just pick out the nearest, geographical feature. But that meant that, so, creating a population register means you have a sort of, so, there's the one part of coming in as an immigrant, which is just getting the right to stay there, and that's the easy part. A lot of people online, there's all these daft forums. Stay away from them like the plague, because it tends to be people like the blind leading the blind. It tends to be like, these Americans trying to like figure things out through the wisdom of crowds and telling each other stuff. A lot of the time people will say, oh, to immigrate on the basis of the daft, you have to get your birth certificate. You have to bring your birth certificate with you. Yes and no. You will get approved for your right to stay in the Netherlands without your birth certificate. Nobody cares about your birth certificate in the sense of citizenship. A lot of Americans think of the birth certificate because of the 14th Amendment as your proof of being a US citizen, because anybody born in the US is a citizen. Your birth certificate is not required to prove your US citizenship. That's what your passport proves. So I often get a lot of really distraught people calling me saying, I'm born outside the US, or I'm a naturalized US citizen. I don't have an American birth certificate. Well, that's fine, that's not what it's about. But what the birth certificate is about is when you go to register in the population registry. So the first part is your immigration procedure, applying for your right to stay, which you can do right, like I said, right after you arrive or right before you arrive without getting a visa in advance. And then with that active immigration status, you can go to your local municipality. That's the level of government that you'll be dealing with most of the time in the place where you're living. It's your municipality at City Hall that maintains the population register. So what is the very first event? They want to put your life events into the population register. What is the very first event in your life? It was that you were born. And your birth certificate has certain information about you, about who you are, that your passport doesn't contain. Your birth certificate says what city of birth you were born in. Your US passport doesn't say that. Your US passport says your state or country of birth. It says who your parents are. So your parents will actually exist in the Dutch government record when you enter your birth certificate into the system. And then you married somebody, so you have the marriage certificate, you put that in, they enter that in as a life event. And each one of these life event certificates, if they come from a US state, has to be legalized, is the word. It has to be authenticated. And the form of authentication that's agreed upon with a treaty between the US and the Netherlands is called an apostille. It's an ancient French word that was adopted for this, A-P-O-S-T-I-L-L-E. And this is something that the Secretary of State of the state that issued the document can attach to it, makes it that the Dutch government can recognize it. So where does this put you if you've significantly changed your identity? Well, for instance, I'll start with, one very common form of identity change, in the US is when, in a traditional situation, when somebody gets married, they may want to start using the last name of their spouse. That's, very basic, sort of identity change in the Netherlands, or in the US. In the Netherlands, however, it's not the way. Interestingly enough, it's there, even in the most traditional heterosexual marriages, when a woman would want to use her husband's last name, she doesn't actually technically change her last name. Her passport name stays the same. The Dutch population register has this idea of like certain aspects of your identity are kind of immutable, for Dutch citizens at least, and can't be changed. But the Dutch population register totally recognizes identity changes that happened in other legal orders, as long as these life events or identity changes are not what's called a violation of Dutch public order. As long as it's not something that is so offensive to the values of the Netherlands. So for instance, you cannot register a polygamous marriage, for instance. If you are, if you are a man and you come from Saudi Arabia and you're married to women, you can't, then the second marriage is void. You can't register, that's a violation of Dutch public order. Or if you had a child marriage, if you married a 13-year-old, that would not be registered in the Dutch system. But fortunately, for this crowd, it's totally okay with any other identity changes, especially if you're trans or non-binary. No problem, the Dutch system can totally cope with that. If you have not modified, if you have not amended your birth certificate, no worries, no problem. Just say, don't worry about it, hold your breath, get your birth certificate with your dead name on it, get that apostilled. Okay, that's your first life event. And it's, and this government register is not public. It's very, you're giving them your trust, and of course, they're maintaining confidentiality with your data. So they put in your first life event under your dead identity, and then maybe you have a court order changing your gender marker, changing your name. You have that apostilled as well. They enter that as another life event. And that means, as far as any Dutch government agency ever sees after that point, they see your current identity. So they can totally cope with that. Or even they can cope with the idea in the US, you can often more informally change your gender marker. It used to be, at least, until this administration, it used to be you can more informally change your name or your gender marker simply by, in the process of applying for a passport, say, oh, by the way, this is my new gender, this is my new name. And the Dutch system can also handle that. They can say, okay, you were born with identity A, this is your birth certificate, we see that your passport is this. If you can at least make plausible how that one identity connects to the other, we will recognize the new passport name and identity as your new identity. And this gets to a really important question about what's going on right now. What happens if my passport gets changed back? Would that then have consequences in the Netherlands? No, that would be considered a violation of Dutch public order. Think about that. It'd be like, the Netherlands would be seen like the US would be seen as sort of like on a line of like Saudi Arabia for doing that to you. You change this person's gender back, against their will. No, so you wouldn't have to worry that suddenly your residence permit would be taken away because suddenly your passport has a different gender marker. I mean, I'm preparing, me and other lawyers are preparing, you might even be able to become entitled to what's called a Dutch alien's passport in that case. If you, against your will, were unable to renew your passport without being forced to get a passport with your biological sex on it, and that was then your only valid travel document, you might have grounds for a case where you could say to the Dutch government, please issue me a passport. Not citizenship, but the Dutch government can issue passports to non-citizens, which allow them to travel around Europe with their actual identity, because of this problem of their own country, denying them their real identity. So that would be also something else that the Netherlands would offer to. So again, self-care, you might find we might find it to be, refreshing. It's daunting. All immigration is daunting. Culture shock is real. It is real. The Netherlands will be very accessible and welcoming to you when you visit there, and then moving there will be something else when you're trying to make friends. It's real, and you'll go through culture shock. But if you're willing to try, if you really want to, and if you feel compelled to, then feel free, and we will help you do it. So thank you very much for your attention. Now it's your turn.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Michelle.
I have a question about, I've been looking into the net for a while, and I know that one major component is this housing registration thing, which is something that I realize can only really happen once you're physically there. So I'm right now kind of trying to figure out how to date. I'm working out some sort of short-term sublet, just a place where we can stay and land. But obviously that's the longer term piece of it that is going to be part of the application. So I just wondered if you had thoughts or advice about that piece of it, and it might be separate from what you're talking about with immigration law, but it is
Sort of, yeah. It's connected, yeah, everything's connected. So yeah, the immigration law portion doesn't technically require you to already have an address. So that is, you can already get your right to stay there, you can already get your residence permit. You're living a sort of half existence. So no matter what, that you can stay for longer than 90 days, you know that you're allowed long-term stay. But when you don't have an address to register at, then a lot of doors remain closed to you. If you don't register, it's not about getting your right to stay there, but if you getting what's called a BSN, which is your tax ID number. By the way, you can get a BSN without living in the Netherlands. People often mistakenly think that the BSN itself is this magical thing. and that once you have a BSN, you can do all this stuff. But there's two ways to get a BSN. You can get a BSN as a non-resident, so you can even come to the Netherlands as a tourist, and there are 15 different city halls that you can go to ask for a BSN saying, I just want an identifying number for my dealings with the Dutch government. This is my address in the US. You give them, say, like a bank statement and your driver's license, and they're like, okay, well, we will register you as this person living on 13th Street in New York. So you'll be registered in what's called the Registry of Non-Residents, the RNI. But a lot of people make the mistake of thinking, oh my God, now I have a BSN. You still can't do anything with it though. It's like a telephone that's not plugged in. If you went to a bank and tried to open a bank account, they'd say, we want your BSN. By the way, your BSN is really private information. You should generally never share your BSN with just anybody, but only somebody who has a legitimate reason to ask for it. So government agencies have a legitimate reason to ask for it. Banks, they also have a legitimate reason to ask for it because they have to do their due diligence as to who they're opening a bank account for. So they want their due diligence that you're just not a rando foreigner who's showing up to open a bank account so you can set up some sort of money laundering operation, sluicing, money from one part of the world to another through your nice Euro bank account. So if you show them a BSN, but the BSN is not connected to a Dutch address, they still won't open a bank account for you. It still won't get you anywhere. It's only once you get registered as living at a Dutch address and you can show the proof of that registration at a Dutch address, then a bank's like, good, you're a known quantity. If you end up being a criminal, the heat's off us. If the Financial Services Authority, ends up discovering that you're running like an illegal money laundering operation, they can go and bash down your door and arrest you, and we won't be in trouble for having opened a bank account. That's why a BSN is sort of magical when it's connected to an active address registration. So yeah, you'll find there's a lot of things you can't do, and you also can't get health insurance, even if you have the approval of your residence. But by the way, health insurance is also a really nice benefit, by the way, in terms of self-care, 120 euros a month. Total annual deductible of 350 euros. So your specialist care, after that, after you burn through your first 350 euros of medication or specialist care in the year, it's all paid for. No co-pays for medications, no co-pays for going to the doctor. None of that bullshit that you have here. But you can't sign up for health insurance unless you have a BSN connected to an active address registration. Again, because health insurance is connected to the Dutch social security system. So what are ways around that? Well, a friend can allow you to register at their place. There's no one saying you have to have your own lease. There's no one saying that you have to buy your own place. If you're living with a friend, it is legitimate for a friend to say, Michelle's living with me, if they're comfortable with that. You often find out who your real friends are. Somebody who's like, oh yeah, come anytime. And then they'll be like, oh, but I heard, it'll make my taxes go up if I have a roommate or something like that. No, it's not true. But
that's not true.
What?
That's not true?
No, it's not true. I mean, I think it's a myth. It's funny. It's a funny myth that I think derives from a period of time. There was a period of time where, oddly enough, connecting to the Dutch tradition that I talked about in immigration law of recognizing just cohabitation as a form of a relationship. Saying you don't have to be married. By the way, like I said, being married is so not a big deal there at all. If your partner goes to the hospital, again, nobody will be like, show us your marriage certificate, you can't visit your partner otherwise, just say it's my partner. It's really cool about it. But sort of connected to that, there was a time, maybe like 25 years ago, that the government decided that everyone who lives together should be viewed as a family, or something that could have somehow consequences for taxes. It didn't usually make people's taxes go up, usually their taxes go down, because they'd be seen as having a common household. But then 15 years ago, the tax code was changed to say, just living together with someone doesn't necessarily mean that you're a family, doesn't necessarily mean that you're a common household. To be a common household, you would have to go an extra step of either having a child together or having gone to a notary's office to sign what's called a cohabitation agreement, or having named each other as your beneficiary of each other's pensions. Then you can be partners for tax purposes. But it's never assumed that just a roommate is part of your family. It wouldn't change your taxes. The only thing that does go up is every individual living at an address does get their own tax bills for council tax. There's part of the tax charged by the municipality for trash, sewage, and whatnot. That's like 150 euros a year, but you get your own bill for that. It's not like your friend's bill goes up. And possibly also their water bill goes up. There is a funny thing where water is charged, still not that much per year. It's charged either a certain rate if there's 1 or 2 people living there, then it's one amount. And as soon as you go to 3 people, then it jumps up, then it doubles. But you offer to, so that's the one bill that actually goes up, but you can offer, it's like 150 euros a year. So yeah, you have a friend who allows you to register there, that's legit, and you are living there. The idea of registration is it's not supposed to be fictional. It's supposed to be where you're actually living, but if you are actually living somewhere, you should be able to register there. The other people who have a legitimate interest in not allowing you to register there is if they're receiving benefits from the state that are based on their poverty level. If they're getting some sort of welfare benefits that are based on not generally disability, but generally just based on not being able to feed themselves, then their benefits would be cut if they have a roommate. That is one case where that would be they would have a legitimate reason not to allow you. So you can register at a friend's place. There are there are hotels, believe it or not, that allow you to register there. The Social Hub is a chain of hotels. The Social Hub, they're a chain of hotels. We've got 2 in Amsterdam, 1 in Rotterdam, 1 in The Hague. They encourage you to register there because they're trying to revive the idea of a sort of residential hotel, of a place where they're sort of like digital nomad idea. They have like co-working spaces on the ground floor. They sort of encourage their guests to, they'll say, yeah, well, we won't have to charge you tourist tax if we register you. So if you book a Social Hub hotel room for a month, not gonna be cheap, it's still like 3,000 euros for a month. But that's a way of getting the ball rolling, of getting your foot in the door and getting registered somewhere. Because then getting registered somewhere allows you to open a bank account. Getting a bank account maybe makes it easier to find a longer term lease, if the landlord then knows that you're gonna be able to pay the rent. There are also, especially if you're looking from abroad, and I mean, it always, finding your forever home in the Netherlands is a matter of like pounding the pavement, I mean, I don't know anybody who ever found, I don't know any normal people, people who are like expats, of course, if you're being recruited from abroad to work for 200K a year, by Heineken or Shell or something like that, of course they're gonna pay a relocation agency to like pry those doors open for you, because they'll be able to talk to the landlords and say, oh, she's good for the money because they're paying her a high salary. But almost all the normal people I know, had at least 6 or 7 different addresses before they got their forever one. I know I sure did. I was, registered at a coworker's house, staying in an illegal sublet, at the beginning. Then what was it? Well, then I married my first husband, lived at his place. That marriage didn't go so well, though, but we're still good friends. But but it was I don't know. I was sort of like I had a whole history. Like I lived here, there, and everywhere until I really had my own address. I mean, one thing you can think about. You could also think in terms of, look, I know I'm just going to get ripped off. I'm just going to get someplace for 6 months that's a rip-off price like $3,000 a month, because you can get that. There are agencies that, if you're willing to put down the 18,000 cash on the barrelhead for 6 months of rent at a place, there you go. You'll get an apartment which belongs to a private person who themselves, they probably paid 900 euros a month on their mortgage, and they had to go away for a job abroad, and they're like, I'm gonna make some money, I'm gonna rent it out for 3,000. They do it through an agency, and everybody gets their little percentage. And that's a totally legitimate lease that allows you to go to City Hall and register there, and you can just think in terms of, okay, moving's expensive, I'm gonna, pay the penalty to start with in order then just to get myself on the ground and find a longer term place. So, even though I'm not a relocation agency, I've come to sort of give those basic tips and advice on it, because it is daunting.
Okay. You mentioned needing an address, I think, to get a bank account.
Mm-hmm.
So would that be like step number 1 really, is to set up that, where you're gonna live or an address before you can even apply? Because I'm thinking like that would be very route.
Oh yeah, oh right, you're already thinking in terms of the bank account with 4,500 in it. Luckily, no, you don't have to do that. There's sort of flexibility in the system.
Okay.
You're given time to set that up and to make your investment in it. So it's not meant to be a catch-22.
Okay.
So if I say the immigration part is easy, it really actually is easy. I mean, it's not, there's very little in the way of catch-22s there.
Sorry, what comes first though? Because if you're applying for the DAP, I know it's multiple steps, but like what comes first? Like, is it the bank account? Is it the housing? Is it I think
the immigration application. It's literally me just filling in a form and submitting it with your, I give you the things to sign, and I submit it with a copy of your passport and your one-page description of your business. Business plan isn't really a big, requirement. It's just a one-page description saying, this is the business, this is the product or service, this is who I'm selling it to, this is the price points, this is who I am. And with that, you already get an active immigration status. You don't have your final approval yet, but you have a sort of temporary status. And the temporary status in turn allows you to do things with that temporary immigration status. And you can go to City Hall if you found an address to register at. And then that, with that, you get your BSN connected to a Dutch address. If you're starting a small business, which is not an incorporated business, you have to actually get registered at an address first before you can register the business. If you're registering what's called a sole proprietorship, meaning it's not if you're incorporating, on the other hand, is a different thing. That's then the first step. If you're going to make a corporation, a Dutch corporation called a BV, you can do that without even setting foot on Dutch soil. You can contact what's called a civil law notary, which is a very specialized kind of lawyer, and they take you through the incorporation process. And there's a lot of Dutch corporations that are owned by people who don't live in the Netherlands. The most famous Dutch corporations, the most famous Dutch BVs that nobody knew are Dutch corporations are the Rolling Stones and U2. They're both of them have their world capital manipulation operations incorporated somewhere on the Prinsengracht in Amsterdam. I forget what they're not called the Rolling Stones, they're not called U2. The Rolling Stones one is called like Glitterbest or something like that. Or no, maybe I'm confusing that with, maybe it was Glitterbest was Malcolm McLaren's corporation with the Sex Pistols. There's something like that. But yeah, they actually have, because the Netherlands has this, beneficial, tax regime for international concerns. Both the Rolling Stones and U2 choose to have their center of their corporate operations in the Netherlands. IKEA is also another famous Dutch corporation that nobody knew is a Dutch corporation. It's not a Swedish corporation, now it's global operations. The founder of IKEA was a right-wing anti-tax nut. And he lived as an exile from Sweden because he hated, how much taxes the Swedish government took. So he set up the global operation of IKEA in the Netherlands. They're the ones that are the spider in the middle of the web that move all of IKEA's money around.
I had a question about the BV. So I know if you want the 30% ruling for the BV, you apply for that while you're still in the States.
Mm-hmm.
And then after you get that ruling, how much time do you have to file the DAP paperwork and get to the Netherlands?
Well, you can't, it's interesting. So the 30% ruling, I'll explain that. The 30% ruling is there's the E word again, expat tax break. The idea of, you're a poor expat, you're coming to the Netherlands you're coming to our shithole country for this job, that you're probably just taking for the money, and it's such a hardship for you to move to the Netherlands. So Dutch corporations lobbied for in the 70s and got put into the tax code that anybody who was recruited from abroad for a job involving scarce skills in the Netherlands is entitled to a relocation compensation in the form of being able to get 30% of their salary paid to them by their Dutch employer as a tax-free relocation compensation. And how I like to, my way of explaining the history of this is, so imagine you're Shell in the 1970s and you need the best oil well engineer in the world. And so the best oil well engineer is named Tex, and he lives in Texas. Who lives in Texas doesn't like paying taxes. Tex has a lot of wealth in the bank, he has a whole, all these vehicles, Shell really needs him. Shell really needs him to come to the Netherlands and work in their headquarters to design oil wells. And maybe for not that long. They know he's only gonna be there for less than 5 years. So they lobbied for and they got this thing in the tax code saying if you as a Dutch corporation recruit a foreign worker from abroad who has scarce skills, and the scarce skills are defined in terms of being a high salary, then you're entitled to pay them 30% of their salary as a relocation compensation. So it's considered to compensate Tex for the expenses of moving, the expenses of driving a gas-guzzling Jeep Cherokee's SUV, in the Netherlands where fuel prices are 4 times more, to compensate him for the fact that he's putting his kid in an international school for $25,000 a year, to compensate him for the fact that he's probably paying more for housing because he's coming in. So there's this fiction that expats have to be sort of compensated for their inconvenience with the tax-free compensation. But the funny thing is, it does work when you're self-employed as well. Why? Because when you incorporate a BV, the nature of a corporation is that it has its own legal personality. It is not you. Even if you own 100% of the shares in your BV is still not you. You're the puppet master of it, but it is still an entity that is not you. And that means that it is an entity that can offer you a job. It can offer you a job on its payroll as its director. This is one case where employment is allowed, by the way, of course, because it's still known that you are actually self-employed when you're the director of your own BV. That's then okay. That's the kind of employment that's allowed under this immigration status. So how that works is you set up a BV first. For all anybody knows, you're just, Ingmar Kamprad, the founder of IKEA, who just wants to set up a Dutch operation and move your capital around the world. You're not moving there. That doesn't imply you're moving there. And then the BV, you tell the BV to say to you, hey, how would you like a job to come here and be my director? And you go, I don't know. How are you gonna make it, how are you gonna sweeten the pot for me? And then the BV says, well, we'll get you the 30%. All right. So I'll move over. So how it actually works is the BV does not apply for the 30% ruling before you get there. It applies for the 30% ruling after you get there. Because it just has to make sure, you just have to set it up to make sure that the paperwork is there that shows that the BV offered you the job prior to you going on the radar as living in the Netherlands. So you just have to set things up that the BV is there and has offered you the job, and then you start your immigration procedure. And then you move to the Netherlands, and that way you can show of all these dates that the offer happened on May 1st, and I moved here on June 1st, and I registered at City Hall on June 15th. And then after you're registered, and after you have your address, and after you have your BSN, that's when your tax lawyer applies for the 30% ruling on behalf of the BV. So it says, see, we offered this employee the job on March 1st, he moved here on June 1st, he went on the radar on June 15th. But it actually means you are actually going through your immigration procedure at the same time. It's not two things that are in a vacuum separate from each other.
But there's not like a clock that starts when your BV hires you.
No.
You have to get to the Netherlands.
No, your BV can, like I say, did Bono ever move to the Netherlands? Not as far as I know. Did Mick Jagger ever move to the No? There's no requirement to move to the Netherlands because you started a BV. In fact, because like I said, the 30% ruling isn't applied for until you move there. So the BV can exist for years, doing its thing as this remotely run operation before you decide to move there. So that's why there's no time limit in between the incorporation of the BV. What will happen in the meantime, of course, is the BV will get audited. I can tell you this. You will get a lot of questions about why is your owner not living here yet? Why is your owner still foreign domicile? And your tax code will say, well, these are the legitimate reasons for this business to be existing here as a headless operation. I mean, it's not like, but that's a different thing. But yeah, there's no time limit in that sense.
I have a question about transferring over a business that might already be located here.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you are already a sole proprietor in the US, you already have the clients, you just now want to basically trade in your EIN for whatever the equivalent in the Netherlands. What's the process for doing that? What kind of gap would there end up being between because if the whole point is you have to be self-employed through your new Dutch company, then conceivably you can't keep working with your US clients until that company is set up.
No, there's no transfer process. I mean, in all cases, you're just starting a new Dutch business.
Okay.
So Dutch business is still always starting from square one. It is a new business. I mean, you might be saying, I'm moving my business operations, from this one to this one, but no one in the immigration procedure cares about whether you even have a business in the US. Your business in the US is irrelevant to the process. Nor would anybody say, also, by the way, another common misconception about the way the immigration side of it works is a lot of people mistakenly think that they are applying for the right to work with their immigration procedure. No, you're applying for the right to live in the Netherlands because you are self-employed. And that actually implies that you're already doing your business operations from day one. That is actually implicit in the immigration procedure. You say, I have a business, not I'm asking for permission to run this business. You're saying, I have this business. I am this entrepreneur. I am this active business. So nobody's telling you you can't work for your American clients until you get approved. I'll explain it in this sense. Right now, you're a freelancer, you have an American company. You come to the Netherlands as a tourist and sit in a cafe and work for your American clients. Nobody's gonna tell you you can't do that. You can come to the Netherlands as a tourist, in fact, and even have business meetings with potential Dutch customers if you were gonna be working, if they were gonna give your American company an assignment. So none of that is prohibited. There's no moment where anyone would ever say, oh, you were working, for yourself, you're working for your American clients before you get approved. That's totally sort of seamless in that sense. There's no waiting time as far as that goes.
Can I just kind of clarify one thing? Does that mean that theoretically you could just kind of go over, keep your American business with the same EIN and like that's the business that then you like show to the municipality?
Well, your American business doesn't exist in the Netherlands,
Okay.
right? It's not the municipality that cares, by the way. It's the IND, the Immigration Authority. The municipality doesn't busy itself with questions of whether somebody's allowed to stay there. They busy itself with your personal details. Where do you live? Where are you born?
So just to follow up with that, if you're looking for Dutch clients as a freelancer, you're allowed to do that.
Like you're already allowed to do that without wanting to move to the Netherlands.
And they will hire you.
Oh, that's a different question. That's a business related question. That's more.
Is there any special requirements that they have to do in order to hire me as a freelancer?
No, for instance, if you have your operation, I don't know, you like design websites or something like that, you could be an American company right now and sell your services all over the world. Anybody, any company in any country in the world can hire your American business to do something for you. And then it's just that your accounting of your business happens here, it happens in the US. What is the case is if, I do recommend to my clients who move to the Netherlands, and this is one of the other things about the government being up in your shit there, that people don't realize is establishing domicile in the Netherlands means you're establishing tax domicile in the Netherlands. It doesn't mean just what happens in the Netherlands gets taxed. It means your entire worldwide income gets taxed. It means it'd be incumbent on you to declare any worldwide income you have. So it's unwise actually to maintain separate business operations. Or if there's a certain reason, of course a lot of American companies, they're not capable of setting up wire transfers to make payments and stuff like that. A lot of my American clients do have an American LLC that they keep running. What I recommend in that case is you don't pay yourself out of the American LLC. You have the LLC exist as your front end for your US clients, but your Dutch business bills your American LLC a management fee. And that's how you get paid for the work that you're doing remotely. And then that means you channel all your personal income through your Dutch business instead, which makes your life more simple. Makes it much more transparent. You have, this is your Dutch business and this is where all your personal income is channeled through. But nobody cares where the customers are if it goes through another layer of an American company.
Hey, so I love the idea of living in the Netherlands for the sake of living in the Netherlands, but obviously it's very disruptive to like the kind of good thing going that I have in New York. One area I'd like to think of is like mental model for what's the last responsible moment to do this, because like it's partly out of wanting to get away from all the chaos here, and then going towards rule of law sounds like a really nice thing to manage my stress level. But that also means giving up my job, my apartment, my friends, family, all that kind of shit. So how would I want to assess like how late can I defer that decision before it's like the boat is left, it's too late for you to do this anymore?
Yeah, we don't know. There's a sad quote. There's a sad quote about Jews in Europe, during World War II. They said, the Jewish pessimists ended up in the United States, and the Jewish optimists ended up in Auschwitz. There's, of course, it can never be. The safe answer is to be a pessimist, especially if you're fearing due to your own identity that things are going to get irreversibly worse for you here, or that doors could close on you. You should go. That's your own. You have to decide for yourself when your job in New York is more worth it to you than your life. I don't know if your life will be in danger, but still, What are the risks? So this is the common question. What are the risks? When will it end? Will it, okay, let's go through several scenarios. Would the Netherlands abrogate the Friendship Treaty? Would the Netherlands tear up the Dutch-American Friendship Treaty at some point? I'd say no. Chances are vanishingly small because the Netherlands never tears up treaties. The Netherlands invented international law. The Netherlands prides itself on being the capital of international law. The International Court of Justice is in The Hague. All these UN tribunals are in The Hague. The International Criminal Court is in The Hague. The Netherlands invented international law, not for the most idealistic purposes, by the way. The Netherlands, there's a Dutch legal scholar named Grotius, called Grotius in the rest of the world, who developed the law of the high seas, maritime law, which is basically, it was like the law of piracy. It was the law of colonialism and piracy. Wherever ships go, if they're the first one there, if they're the first Westerners to get there, then they should be able to just take this island and take all the nutmeg on it and kill off the people living there. That was the original sort of Dutch conception of international law. Now, of course, it's all become much more benign. And most international law instruments are very, nice and about human rights and about individual rights and stuff like that. But to this day, the Netherlands does not make a business of ripping up treaties, does not do that, and would definitely not rip up a treaty with a larger and very ornery party to that treaty. Just why? What would they do? What would would they want to spite? They're certainly not going to spite the Trump administration, but why would they want to spite the Trump administration? And how would they do that? By hitting a base of people who are not Trump's base. Trump's base are not people with passports. That would be, that'd be not a good move. And it just wouldn't be a good move. I mean, would the US abrogate the Dutch-American Friendship Treaty? Recently somebody did send me a link, not recently, but maybe 6 weeks ago, somebody sent me a link that the Trump administration was itemizing treaties to see which ones it could rip up, see which ones weren't necessary anymore. Would the US rip up the friendship treaties, the Dutch-American Friendship Treaty and all the other 60 friendship treaties? I actually also think more due to the politics of the Trump administration. Because how does it work the other way? How does the Dutch-American Friendship Treaty work the other way if you're Dutch and you want to move to the US? It's called, in the US, E2 treaty investor status. That's what it's called in US immigration law. A Dutch citizen or citizen of Denmark, Belgium, or even Iran, still, because that treaty is still in effect, can move to the Netherlands as an E2 treaty investor. What is E2 treaty investor status? Well, to be honest, it's one of the shittiest immigration statuses there is in US immigration law, and I bet that's why the Trump administration would love it. E2 treaty investor status means you can start, your stroopwafel restaurant in the US if you invest 130K in it. The US has a higher investment requirement for that, and it's considered a non-immigrant status. So you can't turn it into a green card after 5 years. You can't turn it into citizenship. I'd say that sounds like the ideal kind of immigrant for the Trump administration. Why would they get rid of that? It's a immigration status for foreigners, with certain countries, certain treaties they're putting money into the US economy and they don't get anything really back for it. They can be kicked out at any time. So merely based on that, I would say it's unlikely that the US would tear up the Dutch-American Friendship Treaty. The Netherlands can, though. That implies the Netherlands is free to unilaterally revise the definition of what is a substantial amount of capital. There's nobody forcing the Netherlands to keep it at 1956 levels. The Netherlands could raise it to 100K. Is that likely to happen? No, I also don't think it's likely to happen. It would have to be, the Netherlands is a democracy, and the government doesn't usually just randomly make rules of immigration law. It makes rules of immigration law in response to unrest in the population. Sorry, stupid. I think it said something that sounded like SIRI, and so I don't know what it said, but would they be likely to? No, there doesn't seem to be any unrest in the Netherlands about the presence of Americans. I like to sort of make jokes about it. Like imagine, somebody saying like, oh, all these weird people started appearing in my neighborhood, and they're so weird and violent people. So one group of people on roller skates and another one wearing baseball uniforms and are beating each other's heads up. So it's like, yeah, no, that's American organized crime. Haven't you ever seen that movie, The Warriors? Then people will be like, oh yeah, why are all these American, gangs appearing on my street? Do something about it. And then people would find out, oh my God, it's so easy for those for the warriors to, to start their like bottle collecting business here and, and do nothing about it, and that's how they got the right to stay here. It would have to be something like that. There would have to be some uptick in unrest. I mean, there's, like I said, the only unrest that there has been with regard to has been with regard to phenomena that exist anyways, and really, and there the main problem with them has been seen as them having too much money. So that also, I don't think most daft-based immigrants are accused of being seen as having too much money if they're doing these small operations. So you're not outpricing people from the real estate market. There would have to be some sort of backlash to immigration. But so far, my impression is that people's attitude is benign, ranges from benign to welcoming as to American immigrants coming. In fact, if you ask the most random, Dutch people on the street who don't know anything about Dutch immigration law, by the way, they have no idea how immigration law works. And you said, did you know it's really easy for Americans to move to the Netherlands based on this, and this? And a lot of them said, wait, you mean Americans weren't already just allowed to move here? Like a lot of Dutch people actually thought that Americans are something like Europeans, who just automatically have the right to live there. So again, I don't see a real risk of the door shutting that quickly. There would have to be a reason for the backlash. There would have to be a reason for the door closing. So as far as that goes, I always like to quote, the Let's Go guide to Europe. It's sort of the Bible for anyone traveling. Maybe it was a more 1990s thing. I think the internet probably killed this idea of like these big, book travel guides to like all the countries in Europe. And I always remember the chapter on Amsterdam vividly. It said, we get to Amsterdam, find a place to stay, find a place to store your stuff securely, take care of the important stuff first. The hash isn't going anywhere. So I like to tell a lot of my clients when they're really panicking, the daft isn't going anywhere. I mean, at least if you're, I say that about sort of short-term people who are like panicking within a period of like 3 months when they are definitely moving. I'm like, definitely in the next period of 3 months, nothing's gonna happen. Of course, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, all bets are off. A lot of things are happening in the world that are surprising, so you don't know. But yeah, you have to make that choice for yourself of when it's worth it to cut the ties.
Does this treaty also apply to, let's say, Curacao or St. Martin?
Yes, it does. So the interesting thing about getting into the post-colonial history of the Netherlands, Curacao, St. Martin, and Aruba are autonomous countries inside the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Kingdom of the Netherlands is made up of 4 countries, the Netherlands proper, and then Curacao, Aruba, and St. Martin have their own parliaments, they have their own laws. They're not, but the things that tie them together are, everyone is a Dutch citizen, so if you come from Curacao, St. Martin, or Aruba, you actually have a Dutch passport and you have full freedom of movement to Europe. The opposite is actually not true. I have a Dutch passport and I don't have actually technically full freedom of movement to Curacao, St. Martin, or Aruba because they're small islands with limited housing stock, but the conditions are not difficult. If you're a Dutch citizen who wants to move to Curacao, Aruba, or St. Martin, you just simply have to prove that you have housing. So what the Court of Appeals of the Dutch Antilles, which is the Court of Appeals for Curacao, Aruba, and St. Martin, ruled about the Dutch-American Friendship Treaty is, yes, those countries are bound by the Dutch-American Friendship Treaty, and they have a slightly different reading of the treaty, meaning, which says Americans in those countries have to be treated exactly the same way as European Dutch people for their rights of immigration. So that actually means that as a US citizen, if you want to move to Curacao, St. Martin, or Aruba, all you have to do is prove you have housing. That's it. So you get actually like a more full work permit and stuff.
So ideally, just go find an apartment, get like dock payment or rent.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
then begin the process.
Yeah, exactly. You'd have to talk to a lawyer there, again, because there's different legal systems. I do sometimes dream of like moving there, because I could fairly easily re-qualify there, but it is a separate legal system. And it also means if you have a residence permit in Curacao, St. Martin, or Aruba, it doesn't give you the right to move to the European Netherlands. It does not. These are 4 separate countries. These are 4 separate countries with their own sets of immigration law. They're not part of the Schengen area, and they're not part of the EU. It's also a really interesting thing about the sort of patchwork quilt of how it works. The people of Curacao, St. Martin, and Aruba are Dutch citizens. They are EU citizens. If they want to move to Paris tomorrow, they can do that. But EU citizens do not have a right of freedom of movement there. That's one of the reasons why they stay outside of the EU. They don't have freedom of movement for EU citizens to there. And there's also, yeah, like I said, and they're not part of the Schengen area. So even flights that go from the European Netherlands to one of those countries, you actually have to go through like an immigration control. So the residence permit in one of those countries does not entitle you to settle in the other countries.
Ideally, I can still set up, let's say, as a freelancer, still work in Curacao and live essentially.
Yeah, live in Curacao, yeah, exactly, but not live in the European Netherlands.
At the end.
Sorry. Oh wait, there's one more question.
So we are moving at the end of July. And so I know you're booked out very far.
You can highly recommend it.
By everybody.
Thank you. My colleagues are available though. Now if somebody emails me, they automatically get the email addresses of my colleagues who are glad to take on the cases.
So like we're about 3 months out. So in terms of timing, and we're gonna do a BV, as far as we know, we're meeting with a tax person on Monday. But like when would somebody who's interested in doing this reach out to someone like you to get things started with you, right? Like an immigration attorney?
Yeah, I mean, I usually, have a meeting with, people first, where I give them the general, here we concentrated all that. And so if any one of you, said that you were at this meeting and you just you now know, you're now fully informed and you want to pull the trigger, I have like a Calendly link. I mean, if somebody's been in email contact with me, I always, usually after the consult, I say, okay, here's the link for a Calendly half-hour meeting by Zoom. Click on that link on the date that you want to pull the trigger, which should be about 4 weeks in advance of your arrival.
If you live in a squat, can you use that as your registration address?
Yeah, it's a good question. Most of the time, yes. So, I know from having been a squatter, I know all the ins and outs of registration. And one interesting thing, there's a lot of misunderstandings about registration, but one interesting thing about registration is the owner of a property actually has no idea who is registered there. That's private information. Due to confidentiality, even the owner of a property is not allowed to just ask for a list of all the people who are registered there. But what they are allowed to ask for is they're allowed to obtain the data of how many people are registered at a certain address. I know this because when I started living with my husband in his rental place, tried to keep it hush hush, but the landlord said, I see there's 2 people registered there, so I'm raising the rent. And my now husband, before we married, and now obviously whatever, but we have our own place. But so yeah, it used to be so if you have a friend who's registered as living in a squat, they can generally give you permission because the permission doesn't have to come from the landlord. The permission can come from the primary resident of an address to register. There aren't as many squats as there used to be. Squatting was criminalized in, I should know my history, 2007, I believe 2006. The first days were really wild. It used to be, in the Dutch criminal code, it was not considered trespassing if you were residing in a property which had been disused by the owner for more than 12 months. So that was the idea to combat vacancy, to discourage landlords from leaving their properties vacant. The idea was if you leave your property vacant for 12 months and don't do anything with it, then if somebody else starts living there, you can't get them prosecuted for trespassing. Unfortunately, it was criminalized in 2006. The right-wing parties, after that law had been in effect for like 90 years, a lot of parties said, okay, we're back. But in Amsterdam, there's still something in the squatting community. It's still done. So there's also a lot of like former squats that turn themselves into sort of like co-ops.
So I'm curious, how permeable is the barrier between DAFT and, let's say, you're doing the business, but you're not making enough to be self-sustaining, and you find a company that wants to hire you? Does it remain that golden handcuffs, like converting you to that company? Like if you go from DAFT to having a job, lose that job, can you go back to
Yeah, sure. Yeah, what kind of country do you think this is? You think it's Soviet Union? You said you were coming here on DAFT, you stay on DAFT. No, not like that. No, you can.
I am coming from America.
But
I am coming from Trump's.
that's true, that's true. It is, yeah, Trump's America is more like, the bad old Soviet Union was, seemed to be when I was growing up in the Cold War than ever. No, your only goal is simply to have any combination of residence permits, any series of valid residence permits for 5 years, but nobody says you have to stay on the same kind. And as long as you have no gaps between them, so that means, if your residence permit for self-employment is about to expire on June 1st. If it was valid for 2 years, it was valid from June 1st, 2023 until June 1st, 2025. And then suddenly this month you found that job of that company that wants to sponsor you. Make sure they get their application in by the end of June.
Can you only have one at a time?
Yes. Well, you can have, it's complicated. You can have multiple residence permits as a status underlyingly. You're only allowed to have one document at the same time. So if you got sponsored by a company, there's a way to set it up that the company can apply for a new residence permit on top of your existing one. You can say, I have reasons for wanting to retain my residence permit for self-employment so I can fall back on it. And so then it goes into having sort of latent existence. The physical residence permit you get would say working as a high-skilled migrant, but you would know that if you lost that job, you could fall back on your existing residence permit. But it's mainly just incumbent on you to make sure you don't get gaps between them. So if you don't get gaps between them for 5 years and going back to passing that silly exam of Dutch language and culture after 5 years, you can get what is truly the golden visa, the long-term resident status. Long-term resident is the name for a permanent residence permit. It's basically the equivalent of a green card in the US, what we call legal permanent resident status, which means you have an unconditional right to live in the Netherlands. You have an unconditional right to work wherever you want. You don't have to keep your investment in your business anymore. You can quit your freelance operation. You have an unconditional right to any and all benefits that Dutch citizens have a right to. Your kids would have a right to pay EU citizen tuition at a Dutch university, and so on and so forth. And it even entails a certain right to move to other EU countries. 5 years. After 5 years, you can get what's called the long-term resident status, a long-term resident permit. That's the goal. That means then your right to stay becomes unconditional. You no longer have to worry about jumping through hoops. You no longer have to worry about auditing your business with a bookkeeper all the time, or keeping that high-paid job. Something that you can finally just be you. So the idea, that's generally how immigration law works in almost all countries. It's always about a period of putting your nose down, satisfying conditions, being on sort of probation in order to get through to the status of just being allowed to be you. And then with the long-term residence status, like I said, it allows you to, it's in development. It's in development about, it varies by how easy it is to move to different countries. Like you can move to Spain pretty easily on the long-term residence status. You can move to Sweden, move to like France or some places. Also, what's nice about the long-term residence status, it also gives you the right to move away. It is a permanent residence status, so you could actually move back to the US or anywhere in the world. And that's your own business. You could then deregister from the Dutch population register. And the ruling of the EU court on when you lose it due to absence is only after 1 full year of physical absence from the entire EU. So long-term residence status is the one that you can technically keep for the rest of your life, as long as you remember to visit the EU every, less than 12 months.
I'm in a very lucky position, I recognize, because my mother is Dutch and my whole family is there, and she lives there, en ik ben 2000 opgevoed.
Oh, mooi.
Ja, en...
Heb je al een Nederlands paspoort?
Nee, nog niet.
Oh, dan moet ik je daarmee helpen.
Ja, alsjeblieft.
Ja.
Ja, dat is het graag. So I've been working with the consulate and waiting on some of the apostilles to come back and stuff like that, but
And let me guess, not that I'm making assumptions about your age, you must have been born before 1985.
ja, 77. Yeah.
Special rule for children of Dutch mothers born before 1985. It's a good one.
And so I'm waiting for that process. It seems like it's going to take, a very long time. And I spoke to another immigration attorney, and she said, just come. I mean, she was like, oh, you're trans, please just come here now.
Mm-hmm.
She said I could come and post up at my mother's, apply for the DAFT using her address, and get that all in process, set up the bank account and everything. And then once I register with the gemeente, I can go through the process for the latent Dutch citizenship that way?
Absolutely, I
That's
recommend that.
all-
It's because, in fact, I'm doing that with a client of mine right now. I had a client who was born of Dutch mother before 1985 and she lived in Vegas. And for her, the nearest consulate was San Francisco. And for one reason or another, it was just too daunting for her to have to fly back and forth to San Francisco. She did get together all the necessary apostille paperwork and stuff like that, even got the FBI background check and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
it's been a nightmare.
But in her case, she really wanted to move to the Netherlands. So I said, just move, just come. You're gonna move here anyway. So she and her husband, their kids, they're here. They moved, got them approved within 6 weeks. And then I've got them an appointment at the city of Amsterdam to go to the municipality so that she can file her latent Dutch application.
Okay.
It's not that it necessarily takes longer. By the way, I know the people at the, I have very good contact with the people at the Dutch consulate in New York.
Susanna has been
Yeah,
very, very helpful.
that's exactly what I did.
Yeah.
It's just why it takes longer. It's not necessarily that it inherently takes longer via the consulate. It's also just that when people don't have help of an immigration lawyer, they don't know exactly. There's more back and forth. Most of my clients that have helped with a latent Dutch application via the Dutch consulate in New York, it was a process of me making sure they had all the paperwork together, and there was a lot of back and forth and getting these apostille for that would take like 3 months. But when they went, then they showed up with everything the consulate needed, and then it was just subject to the maximum of 3-month decision period.
Okay, so then you agree that I can go with that process, I can just go, my lease is up on the 31st
Oh, yeah.
of this month, so I'm like, should I
Awesome,
just be there and then do the DAFT and then initiate the latent citizenship
Yeah.
thing?
Yeah,
I'm
do it
using the
with
DAFT as a way to extend my
Right.
stay.
Yeah, I mean, what it means is it makes you what it means is it makes you a resident of the Netherlands. Sorry if I'm boring everybody. This is about Dutch
Sorry.
citizenship law, but I mean, so the idea of Dutch citizenship procedures is anybody in the world is under the aegis of one of two authorities. Either you live in the Netherlands and then you're under the authority of your local municipality for citizenship procedures, or you live in the rest of the world and you're under the authority of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and going to a Dutch consulate. So merely establishing your domicile in the Netherlands is what makes you eligible for doing a citizenship procedure at your local municipality. And a residence permit for self-employment, crucially, counts as, although it doesn't actually really matter in this case, it counts as a non-temporary purpose of stay, which entitles you to citizenship procedures in the Netherlands. Wow, it looks like we used up the time pretty exactly. Thank you all so much. You were such a great audience. I'm really jazzed. I'm really excited that really excited this went well. And thank you all to anybody who's watching from afar. I hope it was informative for you as well.
Sweet, thank you so much, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Jen.
Good luck, everyone.